What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another album ranking for you guys. And for this one, I put up a poll on the community tab of my YouTube page after I posted the Morbid Angel album ranking, asking for your guys' suggestions on who I should do an album ranking for next. This theme was all thrash metal, so you had the choices of, I believe it was Anthrax, Overkill, Creator, Exodus, and Metallica. And with an overwhelming 40+% of the vote, you guys spoke up, and it feels good that I can finally do an album ranking for my favorite band of all time, Metallica. I technically did do this before, but that was years ago, back when the channel was in its primitive stages and not as good as it is now, at least for me, in my opinion. But I feel so glad that I can finally talk about Metallica in full with all 10 of their studio albums, ranking them, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, to kind of recap how I got into Metallica, I kind of basically explained it in every other album ranking I've done, where I was just 6 years old. It was 2000. The song I Disappear came out, which was around the time of the Mission Impossible 2 movie's release. And yeah, I heard I Disappear, and I fell in love with Metallica from that point on, and then got into albums like Load and Master of Puppets and the Black Album, growing up as a kid, and then listening to the other albums in the following years afterwards, and they remain my all-time favorite band. There's never going to be a band to eclipse them for me. Without Metallica, I would not be here. Dead serious with that. So with my history of getting into the band and all my years of listening to them and having pretty much most of their albums, including live stuff, I'm just maybe missing one live album, and that's really it. But without further ado, let's get into the history of Metallica, the story of Metallica, if you will. So we go back all the way to 1980, where a young Danish teenager by the name of Lars Ulrich moved from Denmark to LA, initially with the dream of becoming a professional tennis player to follow in his father's footsteps, but he decided once he got to LA, screw that, I'm going to be a drummer and have a band, because he had already been playing drums as a kid, and he was already into the new wave of British heavy metal scene with bands like Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, Saxon, Venom, and Motorhead, to name a few. And Lars basically wanted to pursue a musical career once he got to the States, and then met one young Brian Slagle, who eventually created Metal Blade Records. They hit it off right away through their mutual love of all things metal, and Lars in 1981 got to secure a spot on the first ever Metal Massacre compilation album for Metal Blade Records. All Lars needed to do was find a band. However, in the meantime, over in Downey, California, there's a couple of bands such as Spastic Children and Leather Charm with one James Hetfield. And Hetfield had been playing guitar and doing vocals, and talk about an interesting dynamic personality-wise, Lars being more of the extrovert, I believe that's how you say it, more of the outgoing kind of guy, James the more shy kind of introvert kind of person, but the two meet and they both share love of the same bands, even some love of some classic punk like the Ramones and Misfits, the Clash, all those punk bands and metal bands, and decided why not come together and form our own band. And then eventually would come along James's childhood friend Ron McGovney on bass, and the band initially started off as a three-piece with James on guitars and vocals, Ron on bass, and Lars on drums, and they would have a couple of other guys come in for leads and stuff, but together they record their first ever song, Hit the Lights, for Metal Massacre. And suddenly, once that compilation album came out, there was buzz surrounding Metallica from that moment on, because it was oh my god, they're able to craft something like this, and it's something that hadn't been heard before, which leads to the creation of thrash metal, as Metallica are seen as the pioneers of my favorite style of all time, thrash. Now, when we fast forward a little bit into early 1982, James, Lars, and Ron decide, you know what, we need a lead player to do solos, because James wants to play more focusing on riffs and singing. And then in walks, through the LA Recycler newspaper, would come a young Dave Mustaine, who had just folded his band Panic after some tragedy happened with that, and he was looking for a new home. And the story goes, they go to the audition, Dave enters the audition, and he's just warming up. And I guess the warm-up impressed the rest of the guys so much, it was like, Dave's like, so are we going to do this audition? They're like, no, you got the job. Well, I was just warming up. It was fucking amazing. We want you. And then there you go. So now we got James, Dave, Lars, and Ron as a four-piece now. And this lineup would go on for a few months in 1982 before tension started, mainly between Dave and Ron, as it's no secret that when it came to this band getting drunk, most of the guys are like goofy drunks, and Dave was an angry, violent drunk. And also Dave was on many other drugs at this point. After all, his alcohol and drug abuse is pretty legendary if you really think about it. But yeah, the tensions between Dave and Ron got to be too much, and Ron basically decided to just flat out leave after all the hazing from Dave. And then they were like, okay, well, we need a new bass player, and Brian Slagle had suggested, why don't you check out this band called Trauma at the Troubadour Club in LA? And they would see a young Cliff Burton playing, and at first they thought he was the guitarist, because they're like, dude, that guitar is heavy. And then they're counting the strings, and they're like, dude, that's a bass. We need to get this guy. So they eventually become pretty good friends with Cliff, and Cliff said, I'll join Metallica, but if I'm going to join, you guys need to move from LA and come with me to San Francisco. And after all, Metallica had never really been accepted in the LA scene, because this was during the time glam metal was really taking sway, and they were seen as too metal for the punk clubs and too punk for the metal clubs. So it was like, well, what else can we do? And once they got a hold of Cliff, and it just felt natural for them to go to San Francisco, where they would meet other bands coming up around the same time, like Exodus, Death Angel, Legacy, Forbidden, Violence, Possessed, so many other bands from that Bay Area thrash scene. So they basically decided, you know what, this is more of a fit for our style, and they became legends in the San Francisco scene pretty much instantly once they moved up, and started playing tons of shows and just really honing their craft as musicians, and really, like I said, becoming legends before they even have an album out. And in 1983, they recorded 2 demos, their power metal demo and then their more famous No Life Till Leather demo, which got huge praise, a lot of buzz going around. However, no major label was willing to sign Metallica, considering thrash was arguably the first subgenre of extreme metal, because it was much more heavy, much more extreme than anything else at that time. So eventually the demos circulated around all over the place and wound up in a record store in New Jersey called Rock and Roll Heaven, in the hands of one Johnny Zazula, as well as his wife Marcia. And they heard the tape and were like, man, this is incredible. How come nobody wants to sign this band? So kudos to Johnny and Marcia. They decided, to create their own label, Megaforce Records, for the sole purpose to get Metallica in the studio. So the band would go from San Francisco up to New York to get ready for this new album. However, it was during the New York trip. The band almost died when they went to New York, because they had nowhere to stay until the guys from Anthrax decided to pitch in and kind of help out Metallica, considering Anthrax was actually inspired by what Metallica was doing, and decided to help them out to give them some place to live. Moved into this ramshackle house, which could be considered a crack house, and gave them a toaster oven to cook their food, and they would eat canned soups for dinner, on the verge of being homeless and starving to death. So regardless of how you feel about Metallica, you gotta give them respect. They paid their fucking dues early on by working hard and all throughout all the struggles early on in their career. However, it was also during this trip they finally decided to do something about Dave, considering Dave had really grown to become a bit of a dick at this point, especially when drunk or high, including nearly causing a big fight at bars. So the rest of the guys were like, maybe it's not the best idea to keep him around because we're afraid he's going to probably kill us all. So they were listening to other bands' demos and ended up listening to the Exodus demo and would eventually get a hold of one Kirk Hammett to come over to New York to help them out. And, well, they would send Dave packing on a Greyhound back to LA where he originally lived. And yeah, there's a lot of different opinions about this whole thing. I'm not going to get into that in this video. That could be a whole nother topic for like Horseman Podcast or something like that. But the bottom line is, Dave is out, Kirk is in, and then we finally get to talk about their first album, which was released in the late summer, early fall of 1983. We get Kill 'Em All on Megaforce Records. This is a monumental album. This is my number 3 Metallica album overall. It's a classic debut, and not just metal, but for thrash as a whole, because this is the first real thrash metal album. Not too long after this, you would see Slayer come up, and then Anthrax and Exodus, Megadeth, among some others around this time. But it was really kickstarted with this album, with Kill 'Em All. And top to bottom, every single song is outstanding. Hit the Lights made it on here, and it was a phenomenal opener. The Four Horsemen, originally it was called Mechanics, but changed to Four Horsemen after Dave was gone. Seek and Destroy, live staple, learn to talk, live staple to this day. I mean, they play that song. That's like one of the few songs off of Kill 'Em All that they still play to this day, along with Hit the Lights, and sometimes either Whiplash or Four Horsemen will make the set list. But yeah, No Remorse, which is a very underrated one. Metal Militia, the closer, is a thrashy barn burner of a track. And despite what people want to say about Lars as a drummer, he puts on a hell of a performance for his first outing on a studio album. Damn good job. Like, cool drum flourishes and fills he's got going on throughout the album. I just love this album, and I will say, when it comes to the best thrash debuts, this is the benchmark album for thrash debuts. Yeah, you got Bonded by Blood and The Legacy and Show No Mercy and quite a few top-notch thrash debuts to come in the next couple of years. But for me, without Kill 'Em All, you would not see any of this that followed after that. So yeah, my number 3. Now, of course, after the release of Kill 'Em All, they toured heavily on this album in New York and San Francisco once again, and doing a small tour across the country. And then in 1984, they decided to make a huge decision, and that is to record their next album, not here in the States, but fly across the pond over to Denmark at Sweet Silence Studios in Copenhagen. And why Denmark? Well, one of the biggest inspirations for Metallica was The Great Merciful Fate. So they decided, you know what, why don't we go over to Denmark and not only get to meet those guys, but record our next album. And sure enough, they would go to the studio for the next 3 albums we're going to talk about. And released in 1984, once again on Megaforce Records, we get Ride the Lightning. This is another monumental album. This, however, is my number 2 album. And really, when it comes down to the top 2, there's really no wrong answer as to what is the best, because, I mean, Ride the Lightning, it's known for a reason. Like, again, top to bottom, masterpiece of music, thrash, thrashy as balls, especially starting off with Fight Fire with Fire. After a wonderful acoustic intro, then it just comes and punches you right in the face with face-melting speed and just going absolutely berserk. The title track is a classic, and then you get to some really the 2 big main songs. For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is this like marching groove, and it's still one of the greatest metal songs of all time. Fade to Black, their first quote-unquote ballad, but it's such an amazing song. And then even a couple of deep cuts on here, like Trapped Under Ice and Escape, are very underrated. Creeping Death, another live staple to this day. I keep wanting to say staple. What is wrong with me? And then you end off with their second instrumental with Call of Cthulhu, and it's an all-time classic instrumental. It's just so much going on, kind of hinting a little bit of their progressive influence. After all, they were into Rush and King Crimson and Pink Floyd and those bands, and they kind of wanted to show off some more songwriting chops. And really, this album, in terms of songwriting and production, huge quantum leap from Kill 'Em All, I would say. And it is my number deuce. Now, before we move on, so, again, toured their asses off and even got to do a couple of short little European runs before doing a big United States tour. And one show in particular, they played in New York City at the Roseland Ballroom with Anthrax and new wave of British heavy metal legends Raven. And there was a lot of major label executives at this show. And I think it was about like a 5,000-seater that they played. And all three of the bands got their major label deals from playing the show. Raven went to Atlantic Records. Anthrax, a couple months after this show, got signed to Atlantic Records. Or I think Island Records. I could be wrong on that. And Metallica, immediately after playing this show, met up with the A&R guy from Elektra and got signed to Elektra Records. So mid-80s, like 85, 86, was a wonderful time for metal as a whole, because some of these big underground phenomenons, like a Metallica, are getting major label deals just from how good their first two albums were and the quality of their live show. And once they got to Elektra, a little bit of a bigger budget, so they could do more in the studio. And they would return to the studio in late 85 and released in early 1986. We get an all-time classic, Master of Puppets. This is my clear-cut number one. Well, I guess I shouldn't say clear-cut, because Ride the Lightning is such a classic, but I mean, Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets are almost seen as like a pair, because they're pretty much equal to each other. I went with Master of Puppets as number one because I feel like we get more mature songwriting on here. The production's better. James's vocals are better on this album. Everything about this album was better, for me at least. I mean, starting off with Battery after, once again, another beautiful acoustic intro, and then it builds up through progressions, and then into some fast and furious thrash. Then the title track, my favorite song of all time, Master of Puppets. It's thrashy, it's melodic, great lead work. Can't go wrong. The thing that should not be, which is a unique track for them, where they actually tuned down to drop D. One of the first real big metal songs to go in drop D. Well, no, I don't know if Iron Maiden did drop D or they just still played in standard, but the thing that should not be in drop D tuning, and it was a heavy barn burner. Welcome Home Sanitarium. I might as well just name all these songs. Disposable Heroes, another thrashy barn burner. Leper Messiah, kind of like another marching groove track. Orion, one of my all-time favorite instrumental tracks, and Cliff Burton putting on a hell of a performance on the bass on that track. And then ending off with another thrashy barn burner in Damage Inc., Damage Incorporated. Just top to bottom, it's a classic for a reason, and it's not only my favorite Metallica album, but it's my favorite album, period, in all of music. Been in love with this album. It gets played every once in a while. I don't listen to it over and over because I don't want to have it overplayed. I guess, honestly, it has been overplayed in my head, but I still love it every time. I could listen to it for 5 hours straight and not be upset. This album is an all-time classic. Among the top 5, objectively among the top 5 greatest metal albums ever, I will say, because holy shit, fucking amazing. However, after Master of Puppets came out, they did a nice big tour opening up for Ozzy Osbourne, and this was really to kind of go to show you the momentum thrash really picked up during this time in the mid-'80s. because Metallica, the pioneers of thrash, are opening for one of the all-time greats, Ozzy Osbourne, but yet every show they did, they blew Ozzy off the stage. Like, the fans were like, yay, Metallica, not so much Ozzy, because Metallica just really exploded in popularity through this tour and blew Ozzy out of the water with their shows. Then they would do another tour over in Europe with Anthrax, their good buddies from New York, opening up for them. However, during this tour, tragedy would unfortunately strike in the darkest moment of Metallica's entire career. September 27th, 1986, on the road in Sweden, about like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, they're in their tour bus, and they apparently hit some black ice, which caused the bus to tip over, and Cliff Burton fell through the window, and the bus landed on him, killing him instantly, and Cliff Burton unfortunately passed away as a result. And one of the saddest moments of all metal, because Cliff, such an iconic figure in metal. I mean, his bass playing, he was like the Steve Harris of thrash. Like, he played with his fingers, he can play super fast and technical, but yet provide great rhythm and even some little melodic flourishes on bass. I mean, Cliff is one of the top 3 greatest bass players objectively in metal. He's up there with guys like Steve Harris and Geezer Butler. In a total objective opinion, that is the case. I mean, Cliff was such an iconic figure, and he is still sorely missed to this very day. However, the band decided that Cliff thought the band should continue, so they would hold auditions for a new bass player because they were about ready to go tour Japan for the first time. And they auditioned quite a few people, notably guys like Les Claypool, who was at the time in Blind Illusion before Primus even became a thing. But the guy they would go with is Flotsam and Jetsam bassist Jason Newsted, who is a hardcore Metallica fan already, despite being in another very talented thrash band in Flotsam and Jetsam. Jason gets the gig, and what makes Jason different than Cliff is, while Jason plays with a pick, he does also play fingers, and he can play on the same level almost as Cliff Burton, but whenever the tempos really got up there, he went with a pick. And also, just as brutal of a stage performer as Cliff, although I would say in terms of who had more energy on stage, I would say Jason. Also, Jason pioneered the circle headbang, so you're welcome, metalheads. It was all because of Jason. And then also, another big difference with Jason being in the band, Jason can do backing vocals, and he can match the same intensity as James on the vocals. And actually, Jason as a vocalist, very underrated. If you want proof, check out the Newsted solo album, Heavy Metal Music. He's actually a pretty good singer. So, Jason is now in the band, and yeah, some hazing early on, kind of like in their way of trying to grieve the loss of Cliff, which some people kind of look at as shitty, but hey, Jason became a bigger man out of the whole thing, and then they all became pretty good friends afterwards. But before we move on, so they would tour Japan, do multiple tours afterwards, and then return to the studio in late 1987, once again at Sweet Silence Studios with Flemming Rasmussen. I keep forgetting to bring him up. He had been the producer since Ride the Lightning. He did Master of Puppets, and then he does this next album. And released in 1988, we get And Justice for All. This is my number 4 album. Another classic monumental achievement here, because this is really where Metallica started to really showcase their progressive chops. Like, this is the most proggy album Metallica's ever done. It's still thrash, but it's mixed in with these more progressive songwriting structures. Not all the songs follow verse, chorus, bridge. Like, they change up sections here and there, and even a couple of moments of odd time changes. And really, the one complaint that everybody has about this album, and I agree, is the production. Like, there's no bass in the mix. Although the guitar tone on this album arguably neck and neck with Master of Puppets for the heaviest Metallica guitar tone. Like, this guitar tone is cooking. And the drum tones are great. And hell, even, again, people can say what they want about Lars as a drummer, but this was his best drum performance on an album, or for an album. He was just going nuts everywhere. Like the cool double bass grooves in One, and of course songs like One, which are still classics to this day. Blackened, which is a brutal thrash barn burner. The title track, very underrated. Harvester of Sorrow, another like marching groove track. Frayed Ends of Sanity. To Live Is to Die, another amazing instrumental with a couple of spoken word lines, which was words written by Cliff Burton. And then Dyer's Eve, which is probably the most intricate Metallica song that they ever wrote, especially with those fast fucking riffs. Like, consider me floored, especially with the songwriting chops on here. And definitely writing longer songs, like a couple of them being at like 10 minutes long, or near 10 minutes. But yeah, definitely their most proggy album, but it's so aggressive. It's just the one thing we all wished for, the bass being up in the mix. But hey, there are videos out there now of the album with bass, so there you go. But forgot to mention as well with And Justice for All, this would be the first time they would hit the top 10 on the Billboard charts. It debuted at number 6 and really grew a big buzz afterwards, because this was when they started their headline run, the Damaged Justice Tour in 88, 89, including their classic show in Seattle in 89, where it's just balls to the wall intensity and ferocity, just top to bottom. Hell of a tour and a hell of a show for the band during this time. However, heading into 1990, they had their eyes set on doing a new album, and they decided to move back to the States as far as doing production, as it was kind of getting a bit hectic for them to constantly go over to Denmark to do recordings. So they decided to return to the States to record, but they were thinking, okay, who can we get to produce this next album? And it's weird because early on in Metallica's career, their arch rival was Motley Crue. And no disrespect to Motley Crue, I enjoy a lot of their stuff. But yeah, Metallica blows them out of the water. But it was around 89 when the Motley Crue album Dr. Feelgood came out, and Metallica had caught wind of the production on that album and thought, holy shit, this sounds incredible. Like, whoever produced this album made Motley Crue sound intense. So, Metallica decided to pick up that producer, and that would be none other than Bob Rock. So Bob Rock comes in to do the production job for this next album, and they would be in the studio for pretty much about a year and a half, recording this next album because they wanted to make everything sound just right. And then finally released in late summer of 1991, we get arguably the most divisive album in metal history, Metallica, otherwise known as the Black Album. Now, of course, like I said, this is the most divisive album in metal history. There are the group of people that love the Black Album. Then you have the group of people that hate the Black Album because, oh, they sold out, they're not thrash anymore. They're playing classic metal, which is lame. I'm here to set the record straight. I'm gonna say it until the day I'm put in the ground. The Black Album is an amazing album. Is it overrated? Yes, I would argue the most overrated metal album of all time, but it's still fantastic. It's just, yeah, there are better albums out there, but it doesn't change the fact that this is an all-time classic. It's my number 5, just because I like the first 4 more, but it doesn't take away from how amazing the songwriting chops were on this album. Yeah, it was a little more simplistic, but they were able to write catchy riffs, catchy hooks. But the production, Bob Rock, I bow to you, because this is, in terms of the analog era of production, the best sounding analog album, period. Everything sounds crystal clear. You can hear the bass. And people want to say, oh, this is not a heavy album. What the hell have you people been listening to? It's the guitar tone on this album is still crunchy. Yeah, it's more clear and more polished, but it's still very crunchy. If you want proof, listen to tracks like Sad But True, Of Wolf and Man, Holier Than Thou, The God That Failed. Fucking crunchy guitars. Yeah, I will agree, Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters are very much overplayed, and I could probably live without listening to them over and over and over again, but they're still good songs. Really what makes this album the album for me is the lesser hits / deep cuts, like Sad But True, The Unforgiven, Wherever I May Roam, even though I can never really listen to Nothing Else Matters or Wherever I May Roam the same again because of personal reasons that I won't get into. But the deep cuts, like I said, Holier Than Thou, Of Wolf and Man, The God That Failed, Through to Never, Struggle Within, My Friend of Misery, there are great songs on here. And also, there's still some thrash in here on tracks like Holier Than Thou and Through the Never and Struggle Within. There's still some thrash attached, so they didn't leave it totally behind. Yeah, this is definitely more akin to classic heavy metal, and I talked about a little bit when I did my 10 gateway metal albums video, but this album is an important gateway for people to get into metal because of its accessibility and its great songwriting. So yeah, anybody who thinks this album's terrible has no clue what they're talking about. Sorry if you feel that way, but I'm just saying what I think. You can love me or you can hate me for it. It is what it is. You can't please everybody. So, but I digress. Now, of course, the band over the next few years toured their asses off for this album, and then in 1992 got to do a co-headlining run with Guns N' Roses, where during this tour, near tragedy happens. August 8th, 1992, Metallica and Guns N' Roses are playing the stadium in Montreal, and about 45 minutes into Metallica's set, they're playing Fade to Black. For this show, they would have all these 12-foot chemical flames pop up for certain moments in songs to add dramatic effect and add to the stage presentation of the show. However, during the acoustic part, the beginning of Fade to Black, James is standing on a platform, and then right as when the song goes into the big melody heading into the verse, big chemical flame comes up and engulfs James Hetfield in flames and suffering second and third degree burns and nearly dying from this. So yeah, near tragedy. And then of course everything else that we know happened with Guns N' Roses. I'm not going to go too in depth about that. You can do your research about that if you want to, or watch documentaries. But yeah, near tragedy, but James fortunately was able to recover. However, for the next couple of months, he couldn't play guitar and sing, so he would just focus on singing while they would bring in James's guitar tech and former guitarist of Metal Church and Blind Illusion, John Marshall, to come in to play his rhythm parts. Excuse me. So he kind of became a savior for like guitar players. If they get hurt, get John Marshall to step in and he'll do a damn good job. Eventually, James would recover once again and continue to play guitar and sing for the rest of the tour. And the tour would pretty much end in like late 1994, I believe. So yeah, they toured for a long time on this album, while the album sold like hotcakes, went to #1 on Billboard, starting their run that's been going up to now. Every album since has gone to #1 on Billboard. So read into that what you will. But now we move on to the next album. So in mid to late 1995, the band would return to the studio once again with Bob Rock producing, and they had a lot of songs written, so they decided to do the next 2 albums in the same session, but released them about 16, 17 months apart. And the first of the two-parter we get released in June of 1996. We get Load. Now, this starts another divisive part in the Metallica history because Metallica had cut their hair and stripped down their sound even further, and we get Load, and then the next album, which I'll talk about, released about 16, 17 months apart, roughly. Now, Load, it is my number 8 album. However, I am here, I'm not going to be here to defend it again because I've already done a video in the past of me defending Load as well as the next album, Reload. For me, these are good albums, not amazing. They're enjoyable albums. It's like, yeah, Metallica's name is attached to it and it doesn't sound like proper Metallica, but they thought, okay, we have to build off of the success of the Black Album. We're not going to do Black Album Part 2 because even they thought if they, people want to say Metallica sold out by this point. And even the band said if we had done Injustice or Black Album Part 2, that would have been the real sellout. So they wanted to change things up a little bit and go in a more hard rock, blues rock direction. A little bit of doom in there, in terms of writing slower songs. I'm not saying it's doom metal by any stretch. I'm just saying it's more doom-laden because these songs are slower, more in that blues direction. Still metal, but not super heavy. It's more in that hard rock blues side of metal. Kind of like Danzig almost. But Load is my number 8, and you know what? I might as well go ahead and talk about Reload, which came out in late 1997, which is my number 9. These two albums, like I said, I did a full video about defending these albums as well as what I would have done, because one of the big issues with both of these albums is the fact that there was too much filler on both albums. There were some great songs on both albums, like Load. You had the House That Jack Built, King Nothing, Until It Sleeps, Cure, Bleeding Me especially. Reload, you get songs like Fuel, Memory Remains, Unforgiven 2, Where the Wild Things Are, which is, in my opinion, the most underrated Metallica song of all time. If they would have trimmed the fat off of both of these albums and just mashed them into one album, you probably would have had a really good Metallica album if you had taken the best songs from Load and the best songs from Reload and mix them together into one album, and then maybe do the rest as B-side or compilations. And I think these albums would be remembered more fondly. But again, it's just my opinion. I love both of these albums for the reasons that they wanted to change, and also I appreciate them for what they are because, you know what, they wanted to try something different and see what would happen, and that's what we ended up with. So Load and Reload, my number 8 and number 9, respectively. I still think they're good albums, but yeah, they're near the bottom because they just have much better albums before and after this. So after the Load and Reload run, the band continued touring, and then in 1998 they released the Garage Incorporated covers, double covers album, which I'm not going to talk about that because that's just covers, but I will say it's an amazing double album as far as covers go. They do an amazing job with pretty much all those songs, so definitely check that out if you haven't. And then in 1999 did the S&M live album with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra, and I love that one too because it kind of helped really push the whole symphonic metal movement to follow afterwards. So kudos to Metallica for kind of helping to pillarize yet another genre to come. Now, in 2000, we get the I Disappear track, which I talked about a little bit at the beginning of this video. But then we get to another departure. Early 2001, Jason Newsted left the band to focus on his solo project, Echo Brain, and kind of left the band in a bit of a bind because they were getting ready to go into the studio to record their next album, so they're like, oh god, what can we do? So producer Bob Rock would step up to the plate and play session bass for this next album. However, it was during the recordings of this next album, tensions rose between James and Lars. James at this point was struggling with alcoholism, which led him going to rehab the first time, and Lars struggling to keep the band together. But thankfully, James recovered the first time and came out of rehab, and they would continue recording this album. But then it was like, okay, we need to get a new bass player for the tour going forward, and they auditioned in 2003. Auditioned some big names like Twiggy Ramirez from Marilyn Manson, Pepper Keenan from Down and COC, and a bunch of other people, but they would settle with Robert Trujillo from Ozzy Osbourne and Suicidal Tendencies, and I think he was a good choice. He definitely plays more in the vein of somebody like Cliff Burton, playing with his fingers and really fucking fast. Also plays with a little bit of funk, so it was like, you know what? He's a good fit for Metallica. But that was after this next album came out, and released in the spring of 2003, we get Saint Anger. Now, this is my dead last. It is my number 10. Now, I will defend this album for a couple of reasons. Is it a great album? Fuck no, it's not a great album at all. But is it the absolute drizzling shits? Not really. I mean, there are a couple of decent tracks on here, like Some Kind of Monster, All Within My Hands. There are a couple of decent moments on this album. It's just too much filler, especially that song Invisible Kid. I do not like that song at all. Dirty Window is what the hell. Yeah, there are some blah tracks on here that are really dull, but I defend this album because I feel like, in my opinion, this album has aged well since it's come out, for the simple fact there have been far worse metal albums to have come out before this album and since this album. Like, hell, if I were to rank the 10 worst metal albums of all time, yeah, Saint Anger would be, like, low on the list, like 10. Like, if anything, it's the tip of the iceberg in terms of bad albums. It's maybe the best, quote-unquote, bad album ever. I'm not saying it's great, but I'm not saying it's, like, completely god-awful. It's a bad album, but not completely bad. Yeah, the big problems with this album is it was too bloated, as well as the production. Like, I understand what they were trying to go for here. They were trying to go for a more organic, raw-sounding album. And kudos to them for trying, but the way everything was mixed, not the greatest. I mean, the guitar tone's not bad. It's actually pretty heavy. I mean, they tuned down to C, which was kind of unheard of for Metallica at this point. So yeah, definitely in terms of heavy sounds, this is up there. And then, of course, the other big complaint, or the other two big complaints, no guitar solos, and the biggest complaint of all, the snare. Lars' snare sounded awful. Sounded like a trash can, or a ringing trash can. And even Lars makes fun of himself for that. He's thinking, like, he always makes fun of his, like, what was I thinking with that snare sound, man? But it is what it is. It's not great. It's not completely terrible. It is a bad album, but I've heard much, much worse. Catharsis. But I digress. Now, the band, after they got Rob Trujillo in, they would tour their dicks off for the next, pretty much for the next 4 years, and not really playing anything off this album, which was a good move. Back to playing old classics, especially over in Europe, where Slipknot even got to open for them in a little run over in England, I believe, in 2004, which had to have been super fucking cool for those guys in Slipknot to get to tour with one of their biggest influences. And then in 2006, the band decided to do another run of shows over in Europe, particularly playing Master of Puppets in its entirety, because it was at that time the 20th anniversary of that album. And that kind of started a trend that continues to this day, where big-time established bands, whenever they hit their anniversary of a big album, they'll play that album in its entirety for a tour. Like, you know, Megadeth did Rust in Peace in 2010, and I could go on and on. So this kind of started that trend a little bit. And even Lars and James admit that when they did those shows playing Master of Puppets from top to bottom, it kind of put them back into that spirit, and especially in terms of the themes of death and destruction and stuff like that. The band would return to the studio in 2007, although Bob Rock would not be there. Instead, they would pick up yet another legendary producer in Rick Rubin, who, of course, is most known for doing his stuff in hard rock and hip-hop, but most notably his work with Slayer in the late 80s and early 90s. And they would spend a lot of time in the studio, and finally released in September of 2008, and their final album on Elektra Records, or actually no, Saint Anger was their last one on Elektra. This would be their first and only album on Warner Brothers. September 2008, we get Death Magnetic. This is my number 7. Welcome back. Oh, welcome back, Metallica. Back to their thrash roots. Like, this album, in terms of songwriting, is very underrated. There are some killer tracks on this album, starting off with That Was Just Your Life, End of the Line, Broken Beat, Scarred. Like, pretty much every song on this album. Maybe not so much Suicide and Redemption, the instrumental. It's probably their worst instrumental, but it's still a decent song. But everything else I love about this album in terms of the songs. One of my favorites, To the Day That Never Comes, I think is a very well-written song. It's almost like 1 part 2 almost. And then All Nightmare Long, The Unforgiven 3, which I thought was a great conclusion to the Unforgiven trilogy. I love this album. Although the big criticism that I think myself and a lot of people will share, the production. Fucking super compressed, really loud. Like, oh my god, like, what in the hell did Rick Rubin do as far as with the knobs? Like, did he just get drunk one day and just like, hey, you know what, we want to blow people's eardrums out, let's just compress the shit out of all this, make it loud, that will really stick it to him. Well, it's unfortunate that it was super compressed because the tones are great. The drum tone could have been fixed a little bit better, but overall I love these songs for the most part. Like, the songwriting was awesome, getting back to their thrash roots, and definitely the best album they had done up to this point since the Black Album. And that was 17 years apart, which is crazy, but yeah, despite the production being super compressed as fuck and too loud, pretty much every song except for one was fucking outstanding, at least for me. I thought this was a great album. I thought about putting this in my 10 metal comeback albums. I really thought about it. It was on the outside looking in, though, I will say. But Death Magnetic, I think, is a great album. I would say they're most underrated, I would say, because a lot of people like to overlook it because, well, people want to talk shit about Metallica for some reason, and as well as the production. But still, if you can look past the production issues and enjoy the album for what it is, songwriting-wise, I think you'll like it, if you haven't listened to it in a long time. So the band would once again tour their asses off for the next several years, and especially in 2010, where we get a very monumental tour for metal. Over in Europe, we finally get the Dream Tour of Dream Tours, the Big Four thrash, Metallica, Slayer, Megadeth, and Anthrax, all playing together in Europe. And in fact, I should have grabbed it before I started recording this, but I have the Sofia, Bulgaria show that's on DVD, where everybody except for Tom, Jeff, and Kerry from Slayer all played Diamond Head's Am I Evil together, and it was such an iconic moment to see the Big Four thrash tour finally. And then over the next couple of years, we'll do a couple of shows here in the States. I wish I could have gotten to see one of them, because that would have been amazing. But also during the Death Magnetic tour, they toured Antarctica for the first time, becoming the first band ever to tour every single continent on this planet. North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. Holy crap. I have to applaud them for going that direction and doing all that. But as they kept touring, the band kind of lay dormant for a little while in terms of studio output, but would return to the studio finally in 2015, this time with the engineer of Death Magnetic, and that's Greg Fiedelman. He would come in to do the production job for this next album, and released in the fall of 2016, we get the latest Metallica album, Hardwired to Self-Destruct. Now, this would be a double album, or in my case, I got it as a triple. I have a third disc with bonus tracks and covers and live tracks, but essentially it's a double album where you get 2 discs with different material. I have this as my number 6 album. I love this album for the most part. I thought this was one of the best albums of 2016, at least in my opinion. More of the thrash is back, but also this kind of feels like an all-encompassing Metallica album. Like, you get your moments that feel like they came from Kill 'Em All, especially the opening title track, Hardwired. Just 3 minutes and some change of just thrashing fury. But then you also get some stuff that sounds like it could have been off of And Justice for All and Ride the Lightning with tracks like Atlas Rise and Moth into Flame. Even some like Master of Puppets inspired tracks like Spit Out the Bone and such. Then you get stuff that kind of harkens back to the Black Album, songs like Halo on Fire, Am I Savage, Murder One, which amazing Lemmy tribute. Now I will say the only thing that kind of drags this album down a little bit is the first few tracks on disc 2, not the greatest, especially Man Unkind, but it's like for me, disc 1 was perfect. Like top to bottom, disc 1 was brilliant. Hardwired, Atlas Rise, Now That We're Dead, Moth into Flame, Dream No More, and Halo on Fire. Brilliant first disc. Second disc, it was a tale of two halves. First 3 tracks were decent, but not amazing. The final 3, Am I Savage, Murder One, and especially Spit Out the Bone. Great fucking tracks, especially Spit Out the Bone, which is probably one of the best songs Metallica has ever written. Like, holy shit. And then my only other complaint is I wish Lars could do more on the kicks and the toms, but I mean, his style works for Metallica, so I'm not going to complain too much. But yeah, this album, again, kind of like Death Magnetic, I feel is very underrated. Like, a lot of people haven't been paying attention to the last 2 for different reasons. And I say, if you've slept on Metallica for a long time, I'd say these last 2 albums are worth checking out because it sounds more old school, and yeah. But actually, as of recording this, they are touring right now, although recently, a couple years ago, James Hetfield went back into rehab again for alcoholism, but came back out clean, but kind of ran into some issues a few weeks ago during a show in Brazil where James broke down and cried because he just was so disappointed with his performance. Thankfully, the band is recovered and is still kicking ass on the road, and as of this recording, they are actually working on material for their next album, which I'm always going to be curious to hear what Metallica's doing, because even if they experiment with something, I give them props because at least they tried. That's the level of band they are for me. But overall, it felt good to go back through most of these albums, sans Saint Anger, but I fucking love Metallica. I mean, it can't be you cannot understate or even overstate their importance to metal. Like, without them, there is no thrash. You know, some of the greatest riffs of all time come from Metallica, especially from James, because the guy's a fucking virtuoso on rhythm guitar, essentially. Yeah, Lars' drumming, not the greatest, but not the worst, like a lot of people want to say. But yeah, I just fucking love Metallica. I love them, love them, love them. And like I said, if it wasn't for them, I would not be here, sitting here in front of this camera, recording videos for you guys, talking about my love and passion for metal. Without this band, I would not have become a metalhead. And I feel like, despite the shit they get for some reason, they deserve more love, because, after all, they're one of the most important and influential bands of all time. When it comes down to the greatest metal bands of all time, they're up there in the top 5, along with Sabbath, Maiden, Priest, and Motorhead. Like, they're up there in terms of the best, most important, most influential. I mean, I'm basically like I'm just rambling at this point. I'm basically, point is I love Metallica. Nothing more, nothing less can be said. But of course, I know that with doing this ranking, I'm going to probably get a lot of differing opinions about a lot of these albums. But hey, what did you guys think of my ranking? Did you hate it? Did you like it? Or did you love it? And what would you guys rank the Metallica discography? Leave them in the comments section below, and I'm sure I'm probably going to get hit with a lot of visceral hatred. But hey, life is pain. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and until next time, horns high. See you guys in the next one.
Yeah, so music, I think it was just kind of hearing like my parents listen to like just whatever they were listening to around the house, and like flipping through the music channels on TV. I'm not sure if you had what it was like in the US and things, but in the UK we had like a few channels like Kerrang, Scuzz, things like that, which would play your kind of anything kind of mainstream at the time, if you could say so. Like you would get Slipknot, System of a Down,
yes,
and loads of like Sum 41, Linkin Park, and all that kind of stuff.